I am honored to be here and part of this event and happy to be working on behalf of my constituents and all of Minnesotans for a stronger, more representative and inclusive democracy, something that I believe ranked choice voting can help bring about. It is clear that the same forces that worked to suppress the vote of my grandfather, who grew up in the Deep South in Mississippi before the Voting Rights Act, are unfortunately still alive and well today and still working to suppress votes. The big lie that certain votes were fraudulent in the 2020 election was aimed in large part at taking away the votes of many Black Americans in cities around the country. And this intent was underscored by the violent symbols of white supremacy on January 6th. So we must fortify our democracy to protect the vote for all Americans and prevent racists and other extremists from holding power in the first place. I am proud that the Minnesota House passed a bipartisan resolution condemning violence and violent rhetoric directed at our United States Capitol, and affirming support for democracy, rule of law, and the certified results of Minnesota's election.
Thanks for your concern. I have to be honest with you. The attack on the Capitol and the ensuing efforts that were undertaken by so many of my colleagues in Congress to overturn what we know was a free and fair election is really a stain on our nation's history, and something that I know none of us, whether you were there at the Capitol that day as I was, or you were watching it unfold, will ever forget. And look, there's no doubt that the events of that day were incredibly disturbing and disheartening. But I do take solace in the fact that on the night of January 6th, members of Congress, we were absolutely determined to get back to the US Capitol that evening and finish the job of certifying the US election, and in fact, restoring and saving our democracy. So I think that one of my biggest takeaways from that day is just a clear understanding that democracy is fragile and it's a fight. And if we want to keep it in this republic, that our institutions are the only thing and the American people are the only thing standing between us and an authoritarian state. So
how did we get here? That is a complicated question, and I'll do some injustice to it by oversimplifying it. But I think broadly, you can think of three trends. One is the sort of realignment of politics over 60 years along this basically urban-rural divide. Which is also a kind of multicultural versus traditionalist divide, a cities, versus exurbs divide, a secular versus religious divide. And all of these divides have kind of stacked on top of each other and created this incredibly polarizing partisan alignment. A second major factor is the nationalization of politics, that so much of the focus of politics has been on Washington. And so we've lost the kind of diversity of political cultures that gave some flexibility to our broader political system, although it also came with some problems as well. And the third really big driving trend is the close competition for national elections. That for the last several decades, we've been a more or less 50-50 nation. But one of the things that makes this particular moment so challenging and so dangerous is that we have one party, which is, we'll name it the Republican Party, that has increasingly become enthralled to its most liberal elements.
But buoyed by that success, this year's bill were somewhat more ambitious. This year's bill would allow the same things, but in addition, this year's bill will extend ranked choice voting to all of our state legislative and constitutional offices and federal legislative races as well. So we're much more ambitious with the bill this year. I'm confident that we can pass the bill from the floor of the House if we so choose. A harder objective will be in the Senate.
I taught American history, and we were where the experiment in democracy really began in the modern era, and we were looked upon as the laboratory of democracy. But today, there are many countries that look at us as the museum of democracy, that they look at us as the way democracy used to work. And other countries have continued to experiment and reform and more finely tune the democracy that they have. And I think we need to reclaim our mantle as the laboratory of democracy, the country that others look to in order for leadership of how a democracy should work. And ranked choice voting is a very, very important piece of that. So more choices, more voices, draws more people in, gets greater participation of the general public. And it also has a moderating influence in that it does, as Dr. Drutman said, it kind of forces parties and candidates to focus on what they want to do rather than how bad the other person is or the other party is.
Well, we go back to 2016, which was my first race for Congress after the retirement of John Klein. 54% of this congressional district voted for either me or the independent candidate who was a former Democrat. Jason Lewis went to Congress after 2016 with 46% of this district's vote. And so there's no doubt in my mind that ranked choice voting would have saved Minnesota from Jason Lewis.
What this bill does is really focus on putting Minnesotans, Black, Brown, Indigenous, white, rural, urban, folks, Democrats, Republicans, folks with no party at all, at the center of our politics. Because what is really hard, I have worked on these issues for a long time. None of these are partisan issues. And they are not even bipartisan issues, they are nonpartisan issues. They are about voters and being the ones, and Minnesotans being the ones who drive our politics and who drive the issues. So
if I could wave a magic wand, I would simply do away with the Supreme Court's ruling in Citizens United, which allowed unlimited super PAC dark money into our politics. But without that, we need reforms like HR 1. So across what's interesting, and we talked about it just a moment ago, my district is really fascinating when you talk about the impact of center right, center left, that sort of thing, because my district is 25% Democratic, 25% Republican, and 50% people who don't like Democrats or Republicans. And, if every district around the country was as non-gerrymandered as the 2nd Congressional District, I think you'd find a lot of members that behaved a lot different. And you certainly wouldn't get people like Marjorie Greene in the U.S. Congress. So, HR 1 is the biggest change in voting rights, would be, protects the right to vote. It ensures the integrity of our elections. It holds elected officials accountable, particularly in the era of big dark money.
And as all of my career, I've understood and appreciated good government, but I haven't appreciated nearly as much as I have just the last several months. This whole crisis that we have right now around COVID-19, while we surely have a bright light with new vaccines, the darkest days are yet ahead of us. I only point that out because, again, calling balls and strikes, I have seen the difference between night and day to the response to this pandemic since the new administration has taken over. And it's just a stark reminder of how important good government is, whether it's at the local level, the state level, or at the federal level. So I just want to commend everyone here for being part of this. We need good government. It's what basically helps all of us without regard to partisan politics. And I just remain very committed to Fair Vote Minnesota and all that's being done here.